Welcome to Breaking the Couch, a weekly conversation demystifying what happens in and behind the therapy scene to support your healing journey. We're your hosts.
I'm Dr. Dowdson, a licensed clinical professional counselor, a certified school psychologist, and a trauma specialist with Playfully Psyched.
And I'm Dr. Jo Harchi with Soft Art Psychology, a licensed clinical psychologist.
We're here aiming to provide you with mental health tools to address the cycle of generational trauma across the age span, from infancy and childhood to adulthood.
For more information, visit our Instagram page at Breaking the Couch or our website, breakingthecouch.com. While we hope you love listening to and learning from our podcast, it's not a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health professional.
I am so super excited because we have someone else joining us on our podcast episode. We have Devaney Knight, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the states of Texas and California. And I was really excited to learn about that because I'm always looking for referrals to send out to California. So I was like, yay. But I thought it'd be really cool if we talk about relationships, because we haven't done that too much on this podcast. And we'll throw in and sprinkle in some things about trauma, but I think that Devaney comes to us with so much information about relationships that can be really, really helpful for our listeners. So is there some way that you want it to start, Devaney, or something that's already on your mind that's like really pressing for you?
Well, we see a whole lot in social media, online, a lot of things that are happening in the world. And when we consume that, those of us who have significant others and partners, a lot of times we think like our relationships are unique to like, you know, our specific individual things, but like the world and things that are happening recently, I've noticed in practice are bringing up a lot for couples. And so this is a really good topic to talk about how people are relating to one another in the context of trauma and ongoing trauma. But yeah, that's something that kind of stands out, you know, as of late. Of how many people's relationships are impacted by everything that's going on and happening.
Oh my gosh, you're so right. I think, you know, the first thing that came to mind when you said that and everything that's going on is that I remember even so I still think there's a pandemic, even though people don't think there's a pandemic. So that's just, you know, but at the beginning of the pandemic, quote unquote, you know, there was a news article that came out that said divorce lawyers were feeling overwhelmed with the number of calls that they were getting by people exploring, is divorce possible for me? Because, right, for the first time in their relationships, they were forcibly in their homes all the time with their partner, their significant other, and they're like, this, I don't know what's going on in this relationship, right? So there's that piece, right? That there was just an extra strain on those relationships that was really challenging for people to deal with. I'd be curious to know how many people actually went through with it, but I think a lot of people didn't, because then there was a financial strain, like, which is a whole nother layer of relationship trauma in that aspect, right? To stay in something that you don't think you want to be in, but don't feel like there's a way out. So there's that piece too.
I'll just jump in really quickly. I just love that idea of talking about, you know, relationships and how trauma impacts relationships, especially right now with everything going on in the world. And I appreciate that you bring that up. I saw that, you know, I wanted to learn a little bit more about the great work you're doing. And then I saw that you talked a little bit about the answers being within somebody. And that really kind of struck me. I really appreciated that, because there's a part where you had said something like, I forget what platform, I think it was like Psychology Today or something, where folks have everything that they need within them. And I appreciate that, you know, with all the marketing and everything out there, we forget that we're not alone. We forget that we have what we need within, and within the relationships too.
And I think it's important to also bear in mind our language. We have to really, really watch our language. And I don't mean like swearing and profanity, but I just mean, you know, how do we as practitioners position ourselves to say, without having met someone, I believe in your strengths and I haven't met you, right? I believe that there is hope and I haven't met you. I'm optimistic and I haven't met you. So like even the language around, you know, how do we even demonstrate our values of strengths-based work.
Mhm.
And when I look at you, I see all of the things that are possible as opposed to just the problem that brought you in, or just the trauma or the relationship problem that brought you in. What if we were to assume that you have what you need? We're going to discover, while assuming that you do have what you need as far as having everything, the insights that are going to be found, the ahas, the realizations that you're going to stumble upon, they're there. But how do we unearth that? So I think our language and speaking, like, how do we talk about strengths, like strengths-based work that doesn't leave a person feeling more fragmented, more broken, so to speak, right? How do we hold the torch of hope as it relates to strengths-based work? So that's something that's very important to me, as it relates to the mental health work, the healing work.
Mhm.
Yeah, a very important piece and a hard piece, I think, sometimes, because sometimes people do come with their own disbelief, right? That they are broken, that they don't have it within. And so that's a load that we carry for them until they're able to help carry themselves.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about what are some ways that people can navigate their relationships in high stress? I don't know, in the US, right? It feels like it's been one thing after another
Mhm.
without breathing room, right? Without a break. At any given moment, there's monkeypox or a school shooting or a shooting at a grocery store or, student loan issues. It's just so many things that just keep coming at us. I wonder how people can navigate that within their relationships.
Right. Well, one of the things that I think it's important to be aware of and pay attention to is the degree of self-awareness a person has. So, for example, a person can know, I'm fighting with my partner so much more lately. What is that about? They may ask themselves that, or they might just say, we're fighting so much, they have a problem. And so
Mhm.
a lot of times there is the dismissal of all of the things that are happening on the backdrop, all of the things that are happening sort of in the macro system of society that is reaching its tentacles into that, as opposed to, oh, he's just not listening to me, or she's just not listening to me. And so I think it's important to have sort of like a self-awareness piece around, okay, what is happening? What am I noticing about that? And what do I need to first take care of myself before I'm tending to my relationship? I get a lot of interest for like, oh, me and my partner are having, poor communication. We're at odds. We're disagreeing about everything. Our parenting is not going the way that, we agreed that it would go. And it's like, okay, well, let's kind of take a step back from that and look at what's happening for you as an individual, right? Like the couples work is important. The systems work is very important. But how self-aware are you? How mindful are you in terms of how the rest of your life is impacted and affected by what's going on? And do we need to kind of put you back together so you can actually like do this couples work really, really well and show up really well for that? Because sometimes it's cart before the horse. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, our partner's not listening. Help us do this, and then I'll feel better, individually. And sometimes it's just some stuff to kind of work that out. If you are, a female identifying person, I'm in this relationship, and I'm trying to be a really good, wife, mom, to my kids, and trying to do all these different things. Then addressing the relationship problem is going to be a little bit half, kind of half done if we can't talk about all the things that you're weighing, all the cultural things as it relates to being, a mom or a caregiver or any of these other things. And so I've noticed that quite a bit.
You dropped some gems there, but then also I'm like, oh, there's some snapping moments. But I think about if someone comes to you and they say, we need help in our relationship, or like, oh, me and my partner can't communicate. And then you might be like, well, let's also explore what's going on for you. Like this, yes, there may be a problem over there, but before we point fingers, right, let's look within. Let's figure out how to help you get on stable ground and footing. And I would imagine that some people are like, because well, it happens with like, in child and family work, right? People will bring in a child and say, fix my child, basically.
Yeah.
My child needs therapy. Here you go.
Yeah.
Do your individual stuff. And I'm like, come back. Wait a minute.
Yes. Yes.
This is a family thing. This is
Mhm.
not a child's, it's not their issue. It's the family unit. And so
Yeah.
I imagine it's similar with couples work, where you're like,
Mhm.
okay, let's
Mhm.
look at what you're doing here, and let's talk about you, and let's, like you said, look at all these cultural pieces that are happening in the roles that you serve in your life, not just in your one romantic partnership or what that romantic partnership looks like.
Right. And if I may add to that, a lot of times couples come to couples therapy to try and work out whether they want to keep the relationship or stay in the relationship. Well, that's actually an individual concern, an individual problem. So one of the questions I like to ask is, what are we here to do? Is the work to stay together? Is the work to figure out a way to go apart in a healthy way? What are we here to do?
Say it again. Say it again. I'm telling you, because I think that people, I want people, this is going to be on blast, because I think people don't know that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And then people leave couples therapy and they were like, all that therapist did was try to help us break up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so, right. So that's a whole nother podcast episode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, that was good. That was really good.
And did you love the part where you said that breaking up in a healthy way, right? Breaking up in a healthy way, that is something you do not hear about, like that conscious uncoupling.
Yeah.
Oh,
Conscious uncoupling, it's a whole thing. And I will say too that, this focus on trauma, some folk only know knockout, drag out endings.
Yeah.
Traumatic closures, that when a relationship ends, it cannot end in a level-headed, regulated, healthy way. Someone has to get hurt. Someone has to be on the giving end of the hurt. And whoever gets hurt the worst is the person who lost. And so even that is a product of relational trauma.
Yeah.
And when it comes to therapy, I noticed that a lot of times, even in that sort of like intake and assessment, I'm trying to understand what the expectations are of those coming into therapy in terms of like, this is what Dev is going to be doing, and then this is what I'm going to be doing. She's going to fix it, and she's going to make us happy and healthy together. And sometimes that I have to kind of help work that out to help clients kind of understand, like, here's what you can expect. Here's some of the things maybe you can't expect, and here's why. So that they do feel empowered and take ownership for the process.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. The other piece, when you think about from the trauma perspective, people may only know those drag down, knockout fights for an ending. And then there's the other spectrum, people who only know complete abandonment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It looks different now. Ghosting,
Mm-hmm.
right? It looks different now, but I think back even back in the day where it was like I'm going to use a gendered example, but like dad goes out for a gallon of milk or dad goes out for cigarettes and never came back.
Yeah.
Right. And so all these different ways that abandonment can show up in relationships, and they think like we're going to fight this out, or someone's going to completely walk away and not say anything. And neither of those are healthy.
Yeah.
Neither of those are healthy, and especially if you're thinking about trying again into another relationship. Both of those are trauma responses.
Yes. Yes. And how do we behave in relationships when we think that's coming?
Oh, yeah.
I'm afraid you're going to abandon me, and so I'm going to anxiously chase you, or I'm going to push you away before you can push me away. Or when you should withdraw affection and emotional connection, I'm going to behave like I'm indifferent. There's so many different responses that we can have in anticipation of what we think might happen or could happen, because that response is being activated.
Yeah. And then we live up here because we don't know how to communicate what I'm fearful of or what I'm thinking or what I want. I'm going to do it all up here. And you have no idea what I have going on up here, but I have now I'm behaving and acting on the fantasy aspect of our relationship that doesn't exist in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then I'm manifesting what I don't want
Yeah.
usually because I'm living in the fantasy.
Yeah. But the trauma is part of it is fear that something has happened is going to happen again. If I can get ahead of it, I won't have to be impacted in such a negative way.
Yeah.
Whereas it's creating a very different reality.
I love I'm geeking out over here. I love hearing about this from a romantic relationship perspective, because it's the same. Trauma is what I do all day and every day, but it's the same thing, right? Your fear response system is trying to protect you and keep you alive. It looks different in a romantic relationship, but it's doing the same thing, like you just said. Oh my gosh, this feels just like before when I got really, really hurt, when we almost didn't make it, right? So now I'm hyper vigilant, right? Looking for any tiny little cue that's going to tell me that this is the exact same situation. And now I'm going to respond. And this is not all in a cognitive level where you're like, this is what it's going to do. This happened to me before, but it's on a felt level. And you're responding on that felt level without knowing it. And that's why like therapy can be so helpful, right? Because like you said, you're over here just reacting and responding in this from a trauma response system. And that's not going to work well in a healthy relationship.
Right.
Yeah. And it sounds like you kind of hit on it too, that, maybe sometimes, and it's a hard one for people to hear, brace yourselves, but maybe sometimes two or more people who are severely traumatized, who haven't done their work, can't be in a healthy relationship until they've done their work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I say that because I don't know if you encounter this, but I hear people saying like the idea that someone else is their half, or someone else will heal them, right?
Yeah.
Someone else's love can heal them. It's like,
yeah,
setting yourself up.
And it's creating, and those expectations are not always communicated. They're implied, right? People seek validation of their trauma experiences through their partner without realizing, like, if I just find my happily ever after, that will be the thing that kind of, like, the love and the weight of that is really going to cancel out the impact of these previous experiences. And my partner is just going to know intuitively how to show up for me. And I won't have to ask or say what I need. They're just going to intuitively know, right? And so there's that piece of it. And then you also have this other piece of, I will say that this emerging, this wave, we see these waves of just really excellent content across these social media platforms. Of course, we know it doesn't take the place of actually consulting with a licensed professional.
That's right. However,
we talk a lot about, and I've been trying to think about, like, how can I communicate this on my platforms as well? But the notion of, or the culture of, like, toxic behavior, we got to call that out and set boundaries, and you just have to stand your ground and change your thinking. Like, all of this is great in theory, right? But we're not connecting, like, the other, right? Their problem, mom's unresolved trauma, dad's abuse, like all these different things. We're not calling that behavior as product of trauma. We're not really calling it that so much. We're calling it the other people, not us, those other ones. And I think it's important to make space for, in these conversations, for, some of us are guilty of emotional manipulation. Some of us are guilty of speaking out of turn. Some of us are guilty of knee-jerk reactions that are not very helpful. So if we are to call out toxicity, we also need to talk about toxicity as it relates to trauma. That a lot of those behaviors that we're seeing are coming from, I'm afraid of being left out. I'm afraid of being left. I'm afraid of feeling unloved. I'm afraid of being seen as broken. Like, all of those things fall under that same umbrella. I would argue that.
That's a good thing to argue. We talked a little bit, we talked more in depth than we'll go in today, but just when I struggle when, say, these toxic behaviors, right? Or like someone is a toxic person, is more so, because it's like, well, if we put it that way, I have definitely been the toxic person, especially even in just like friendships, because I was hurt, because I have a trauma background, right? I have an extensive trauma history, and I couldn't see it when I was in it, though. I couldn't see that I was being needy and possessive in the ways that, like, you can't have anybody else be your best friend. Like, I couldn't, and I think I have a good heart. I'm a loving and caring person, right? But I wasn't in the trauma recovery brain that I am in now.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I think that, like you said, these sound bites that we put out on our platforms can be really helpful in certain ways, right? But they don't connect the pieces, and they aren't showing that, okay, what also are you potentially doing that contributes to this, and what foundation is that coming from? Have
Yeah.
you looked at, what's hurting you other than this other person, but like what's happening inside and what has happened to you?
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah. 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 I love this saying that the work that we do as healers always comes back to us in some way, even when it's so inconvenient to be reminded of that. It's like, yes, I remember that. There's like that moment of like, oh, here I am trying to help this family to communicate more respectfully, more clearly. Is there any feedback for me to be, maybe I should communicate my needs a little bit more in this relationship here. And so sometimes our work has a way of stepping on our own toes. But it's a really important, I think, experience to have always as a healer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very needed, and helpful
Mhm.
to ourselves, but then also helpful to the people that we serve, right? To be able to have that lens, that reflective practice. But then also, I love that you were talking about how on social media, to be able to figure out ways to portray that responsibly, differently, more often than it's occurring right now is super
Mhm.
important, right?
Yeah.
I think that I feel like, I don't know how real this is, but I feel like the world is opening up to trauma in a way that they hadn't done 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even. So people are open to the idea of, oh, this could have been from something that happened to me. But again, not when they're in the moment of looking at someone else being quote unquote toxic.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
those are the times where they kind of have blinders on, and
Mhm.
can't also see, well, that person, maybe they also have a significant trauma history, and it's also not
Yeah.
coming from this manipulative, purposeful place. Doesn't excuse what's happening,
Yeah.
but it gives us an understanding of what is going on.
Mhm. And I do want to make the distinction as well that it's one thing to acknowledge and understand, even to accept, because that's still very different from tolerating
Mm-hmm.
and remaining willing to unchange or to consider an alternative, circumstances being as they may. We can't, on the one hand, we don't want to demonize people who have trauma, but we can also say, and here are some things that simply just don't work very well for me in a relationship with someone.
That part.
I get that you have that, you have to work that out. It's unhealthy for me though.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I can't position myself to tolerate this kind of behavior. No judgment, but I have learned that being handled or dealt with this way or treated this way, it really ignites my own trauma that I'm working to recover from. This may not, and this could be a romantic relationship, friendship, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a line between those.
Yeah. I think I like that you said, I mean, you're absolutely right. You don't have to then stay in a relationship just because you identify or understand that someone is traumatized, right? Or has a trauma history. When you were saying that, it made me think about people pleasers, right?
Yeah.
Which I conceptualize that as a trauma response. And we've talked about that
Mm-hmm.
before. But
Mm-hmm.
this idea that it goes into multiplicity of emotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can at the same time be compassionate, have empathy for someone, and still acknowledge that they hurt you and that you don't need to continue engaging further with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But people have this either or, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, either I understand what you're going through, which then means I have to stay with you, or I have to, I can't leave you because of this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I have to completely demonize you only, and right, and it's like, no, yes, acknowledge what they've done, like, absolutely, and get yourself out of there, right?
Yeah.
You're allowed, you
Yeah.
matter, right? You're allowed to matter. You're allowed to, I call it the B word, set that boundary where you're saying, you know, like beautifully what you just said, Dev. I hear what you're going through. I know that you've been through these things, but this behavior, this interaction, being treated this way is not something that I can allow to happen to myself. So I will have to exit out.
Yeah.
It's really challenging for people to
Especially
think about.
if your trauma response is to try to blindly submit so that things kind of, because really that person really just wants to neutralize their own anxiety around the conflict. So it's like, whatever I have to do, please don't leave. I can be here and be enough for you. And that's where we start getting into like the codependency and like the really unhealthy, you know, entanglements that occur in relationships, romantic ones.
Exactly. Yep. Trauma response gets in, and we're over here telling them, okay, but like it's okay to leave, and they're like, but okay, no, because that doesn't feel safe. I don't know what that life is like. I think we should highlight the fact that a lot of times when your trauma response system is activated, and it's the one that you don't have much control over at that point, but the thought of doing something different is terrifying because it is unknown. And your brain can create all of the different worst case horrible scenarios but if I leave, then I'm going to whatever XYZ is going to happen. Or that one time, you know, your body's remembering that one time when I was 5 years old and I tried to stand up to XYZ person who was, you know, 3 times bigger than me, and it didn't work. That's going to happen again. It's like, you're not your 5-year-old self, right? We got to speak to your 5-year-old self and let them know that they're safe now. But you're right. It's hard to set that boundary. And people think that when they do set a boundary, if they finally get the courage that like, maybe it's going to feel great. I'm going to feel free. And you don't always feel free, right? Like,
And that's why I love that you gave those of us who have fight, flight, or frozen in relationship, like a specific line of here's what you could say. I love that. I hope that we are able to pull that out and just share that with folks, because that's so helpful. If you do fight, flight, or freeze, you could kind of use that line that you just shared as far as maybe not necessarily saying, you know, some of the TikTok advice or some of the social media advice as far as like, if they aren't doing these 3 things, leave. But if this doesn't fit for me, I am, you know, going to have to honor that. I'm not saying it as beautifully as you did, but I know that we'll be able to pull that.
Good.
I'm
glad it'll be useful.
Oh, definitely. I think that anytime we're talking about relationships and trauma, it's going to be helpful for people. And talking about that, like I think about, you know, some of this, where my mind always goes to like early childhood trauma and those early relationships and how that can play out. And people pick partners often that are familiar to them and they don't even realize it, but it's familiar in the relationship structure that they experienced from a primary caregiver or some relationship that they had when they were young. I'm just curious if either of you had comments about that or thoughts about that.
None here. Of course we do. I can't think of anything. So, you know, 2 things I will say is, as a therapist and a lifelong learner, I'm constantly trying to learn more, read more, do more. And I will tell you, couples work has led me to wanting to extend practice into EMDR. Just saying. Just based on this conversation, right?
Preaching to the choir. We're both EMDR trained therapists, so like.
Oh, that's awesome! Okay, we'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good.
Yes. We'll definitely sort of be in touch. But I will say that as practitioners, as researchers, we are very much convinced of the long-term significance of early childhood relationships. Now, I'm not talking about who gave birth to us. I'm not talking about. I'm talking about caregivers that had a hand in our upbringing in some way, shape, or form. And a person who had a hand in our upbringing is anybody that has influenced our view of ourselves, others, or the world. And so we're really convinced of the long-term significance of those experiences. I will say, shamefully, although not, I was a therapist for several years before I really connected that your inner child really doesn't go away. your inner
Mhm.
child does not die off. And you know, and
Mhm.
in my mind, I think about like my own experience, and I'm just like, so I'm in the habit of asking clients, you know, how old do you feel as you tell that story?
Mhm.
As
Mhm.
you're checking in with
I
your
like that.
body, how young or how old do you, okay, so you feel 13, you're rebellious phase. Or
Mhm.
you, oh, 5, when you really didn't have any choices.
Mhm.
And so I will say there's a lot of connections to be made between things that happen in the present, things that happen relationally in the present, and how so much of that can be tied to earlier experiences from two perspectives. One, either you're trying really hard to repeat a pattern, or you're trying really hard to not be like someone who exhibited a particular pattern.
Mhm.
And I see that at play quite a bit. So those early experiences matter deeply, deeply to a lot of the issues I see couples facing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's at the cellular level, like the epigenetic level,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I always say that those early relationships, your first relationships, early caregivers, set a blueprint, like a map, for your internal system about how do you show up, how do you engage,
Mhm.
and what type of relationships do you seek. Just highlight, it's not conscious awareness.
Yeah.
It's not you
Yeah.
going through this, logical thought process or checklist, right? But it's based a lot on that felt sense or how, familiar something is. And until we can get attuned to that, until we can, cradle our inner baby, hold our inner child,
Mhm.
feel what they're feeling, right? Let them know that they're safe. It's really hard to break those patterns, right? And that's one of the things that therapy can be really helpful for people to do, to identify, to have those conversations with their inner child. I'm going to use that. How old did you feel when you just told me that
Mhm.
story, that example? I love it. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to the survival element of trauma, there are some
Mhm.
things that, you know, this is going back in history, that the African slaves had to do to survive.
Mhm.
And a lot of that, fortunately, has been unlearned, and a lot of it has not. And they had to raise their children to expect the same of the world. And so children were raised with the sort of unspoken notion that the experience that I have had is the experience that you will have.
Mhm.
I need to break your will and prepare you for that.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
And so in practice, in therapy with clients who also are parents, drawing parallels to, you know, you're now at an age where you can look clearly at the generation that came before and the one that's coming after you.
Mhm.
Is there anything that needs to be tweaked around, right? Because that was trauma informed parenting, but in a different kind of way,
Yeah.
right? I need to get you prepared for the trauma that you're going to encounter. And
Yeah.
this is the way you're going to have to move through that. But as history changes and things become more accessible and available to us, do we still have to hold on to those same teachings verbatim? The experience that I've had is experience that you will have. And it does also, I think, bleed into relationships, how you have to comport yourself in a relationship, right? You want to keep a partner, this is what you have to do, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
You're bringing up so much stuff. Two streams of thoughts just came to me. One, just kind of thinking about women. I was thinking about this earlier today. And I guess as I'm shifting how I viewed women of the past, Black women of the past in certain ways, like in the family and stuff, in the sense that, something as simple as, and I think it was the 1970s, 1960s or 1970s, when women could finally get bank accounts by themselves without a man signing for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you pause and think of the gravity of that,
Mm-hmm.
how many women stayed in relationships because society governed it that way? Relationships that were unsafe, relationships that were completely traumatizing. And then because of that, how many people, that whole generation that grew up in those households, but the way the women rationalized that, way that it was told, is stay together for the family, right? For the
Yeah.
safety of the family, stay together for the
Yeah.
children. They had to rationalize the trauma that they were experiencing because there was no real outlet in this at a societal level, at a community-based level, right? And then I follow the Conscious Lee. So George, I think his name is George Lee on I think all of his platforms. But so I'm hoping to do this story to justice, and we'll put a link to his video that he did it. But he did a really good story in talking that was for generational trauma that, just like you just said, right, reminds me of post-traumatic slave syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. He talked about, he was having a conversation with his father, and his father was saying how, well, back in my day, we used to get beat. If we did something out in public, we would get beat. And that was because our parents knew that if someone else caught us, you know who the someone else is, because this is a black, George Lee is black, Conscious Lee is black. If other people caught us, it meant they would kill us.
Mm-hmm.
So our parents beat us, and they can beat us within an inch of our life, but they beat us to teach us to stay out of the street. They beat us to do these things. They beat us to keep us alive. And so we didn't look at them as abusive. They were our saviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we beat our kids to essentially keep them alive, even though the system has changed a little bit. And so it's passing down, that's at a conscious level, right? And the way that his father could reflect on it now and think about it now. But it's that same thing, right? There's these things that we pass down, sometimes behaviorally, sometimes genetically, because of, in the Black community, because of the enslavement of African people on American soil, right? Yeah. And absolutely that shows up in our relationships, whether friendships or romantic partnerships, right? Because we were governed and ruled by these belief systems that were to keep us alive. Our brains, so sad to think about it, right? But so many of us grew up in traumatized states with our brains just experiencing these things, that it became a normalized, that it became a part of our cellular structure. And then we enter into romantic relationships with those same systems in place.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And we look for partners who are going to fit what we believe, or sort of our expectation of what life is going to be. We've got to find a puzzle piece that can kind of click and, fit neatly into that experience that a lot of times, a lot of people don't have the opportunity to really explore what's outside of that. Only one possibility of just living my life, making sense and meaning of my life in this way. It's laced with trauma. So how do we, a lot of times it's not even really coming up until you're deep into a relationship and it starts to get real.
It's get real fast. But it's like, you're so deep into it. Oh, I wish, this goes out to what I'm always wishing is that therapy could be so normalized and appropriately accommodated for in the therapist level, but so normalized that just like people try to get wellness checks, just like there's a requirement to get your shots, that you kind of go in to be able to explore these things about yourself. That is just a part of daily living, right? Especially there's just so many of us that have had generations and generations of traumatic experiences, that there's the big thing now about being cycle breakers, right? And in some ways we are, and we're kind of breaking the cycle, but that's a lot of weight to put on one person or one generation to break the cycle of hundreds of years.
Yeah.
That's a lot of weight.
Yeah. We are responsible for being aware of what's in our space and governing that. Because it's hard to break a cycle without, also somehow single-handedly changing society at the same time. But, those of us who have trauma, that leads to people-pleasing, perfectionism, and fixing, people do try to take that on, right? I don't know if you guys can relate to having clients in practice and, they're looking at their trauma, they're sitting in it, they're developing new meaning, they're, shifting their thinking, and then they start looking at their family members like, okay, you all need some help. Y'all need to go see Dr. Down. That's what y'all need to get y'all all to Dr. Down, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna give you get a referral, everybody needs to go, right? Because then they begin to sort of see things a little bit clearly, and it's like, hey, what worked for me is gonna work for all of you guys.
Yeah.
maybe not. Probably more so on the side of not, right? And so that's a lot of weight to then say, I'm now going to make it my mission to make sure like everybody gets this help, everybody works through all of their stuff. We have to be able to support people in, okay, in this space, what can you control? What can you not control, right? How does taking care of what you can control deal with your own, anxieties of whatever. And so I think it's really good to be supportive of clients and recognizing that
Yeah.
as well. It can't fix it all at once.
It brings up survivor's guilt too, though.
Yeah.
Right? Because, and if we think about, and I love you talk about families and in romantic partnerships too, when one person has been going to therapy and getting better and understanding themselves in a different light and going through their trauma recovery path, right? There's sometimes guilt of like, I'm feeling better, I'm doing better, I can understand these, and my partner isn't. But maybe if I can just help them, right? If I could just like help heal them or like get them on the right track, there's that piece. And so that it becomes such a weight, can become such a weight. And then there's also the point where, kind of the example we gave earlier, it can be really hard when you're realizing what are your triggers, when you're realizing what are the things that you need in your space to help your recovery continue. And if a partner or family member, we talk about this too, when people kind of pull back from their families when they're starting to feel better because they're like, oh, but if they're not going to get help, I don't know how to engage. I can't, because they're my trigger, or like that behavior or that way of being, or them telling me that they beat me for my own. I can't deal with that. I can't have that in my space. And then they feel guilt for that, right? Because they had a narrative of, well, it means what is a good partner? What is a good daughter? What is a good son? What is a good aunt, uncle, whatever, right? And am I being selfish? And we have like community layers of that where depending on what culture you're from, right? To pull back from your family is, ooh.
Yeah. It's the cardinal sin for in a lot of family systems.
Yeah.
To choose oneself, which is, very black and white. It's either us or you. You or us. You have to choose between individualism and collectivism. It's a really tricky thing to navigate, which is why I try to get too far down that road after, before building some rapport and understanding just really how the person's relationship. I can assume that you really want this thing to really be mended and it's going to really work well for you. So it's my job to really make sure that I really understand that, because there is sort of that dichotomous thinking that ultimately doesn't serve people. Most human beings give themselves two choices.
It's not enough.
Yeah. It's limiting.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's right. Well, as the white girl in the room, I will just take a minute to acknowledge, my white privilege and being white-bodied. And I say that for a couple different reasons. I'm over here just learning so much, and I'm so grateful for what you've shared. I also want to say that a lot of the relationship therapies are like Imago, Gottman, a lot of white people, a lot of colonialism in the relationship therapies. And I'm grateful to be able to refer to you now too, both, in my practice, but also just, Miss Devaney Knight said, blah, 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 instead of always having to, I sometimes choose not to refer to like Gottman or Imago, because it is perpetuating white supremacy in therapy. So I'm super grateful for what you've shared.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I also, I appreciate Gottman's work. And I say sometimes you got to take a theory, you got to pepper it a little bit. Got to throw some seasoning salt, and some Cajun spices, and just kind of, pepper it, really tailor it to sort of like fit like the cake, that you're sitting working with, because really all theory really is, or just really building blocks to help us understand stuff a little clearly. But of course, culture and society does feed into that. So we have to be mindful, especially working with, LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit clients. Like there's so much around, again, language and how do we sort of pepper this? What can we take from this that is, applicable? So, but I appreciate you voicing that too, Dr. Joharti. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Well, I'll kind of close up. I wish we could keep going, but of course, come back for a part 2 if you'd like. But yeah, I just want to kind of wrap up with, that you talked a little bit about giving people the torch of hope before you even meet them, and just being really mindful of that hopeful, strength-based language before we even get a chance to work with folks. We talked about, self-awareness. You taught us a little bit about how people can kind of look within before pointing fingers and before sometimes even engaging in the relationship work. And we talked about trauma in relationships, everything from abandonment and reaction big reaction type of stuff. So fight, flight, and freeze in relationships, and kind of how to move out of that into a more, here's what works for me, here's what I've tuned into, and here's kind of what I need, in ways that are a little bit more on like acknowledging and noticing, if I'm saying that correctly. And then we had a really helpful discussion, I think, about breaking cycles and white supremacy and how that has showed up in relationships and can show up differently nowadays.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm
Mhm.
so honored that you came and to talk with us.
Absolutely.
And our listeners, and I just really enjoyed it as well. Got my brain flowing. So, so Devanny, tell the audience, how can they find you? Where can they reach out to you?
So Westlake Houston Counseling is located right outside of North Houston in Kingwood, Texas. I am licensed in Texas, also licensed in California. Most of my work currently is central to Texas. We can be reached at info@westlakehoustoncounseling.com. Our website is www.westlakehoustoncounseling.com. And then we're also on Instagram with same name handle. And I'm also on TikTok, which is Therapy with Devanny. I'm still getting used to that platform. But Dr. Donaldson, you are amazing. I just love your content. So I'm glad we're following each other.
Yes. Thank you so much. And then we'll make sure that you all can actually reach out to Devanny in those places. It'll be in the show notes. You know that we are on Instagram at Breaking the Couch. We have our website, breakingthecouch.com, and you can feel free to send us a message on Instagram, direct message us, tag us in your stories. Let us know if there are topic ideas that you want to share, things that you're experiencing that you want us to know or explore further in our episodes. You can fill out the survey on our website. We mentioned a book in this episode, so we'll make sure that the book link is included. And of course, with our book link, the primary reason for that is because it helps save local bookstores, although we do get a small kickback. That just helps us produce more episodes. This does cost a little bit of money, so we'd love to continue producing some. And we're on YouTube, of course, because it helps with accessibility for people who are deaf and hard of hearing or need access to transcripts and or captions. So those are all the ways that you can reach out to us. Until next time.
If you are looking for a therapist for yourself or your child, you can visit our websites, playfullypsych.com or softheartpsychology.com.
We appreciate you joining us this week and can't wait till there's another opportunity to jump on the couch with you next week.